Two men, two nations at war. One heartbeat in the clouds where guts, skill, and fate all went for broke. July 28th, 1940. The Battle of Britain was hitting full throttle. High above the English Channel, engines roared like thunder. The sleek British Spitfire faced off against the razor-edged Messerschmitt 109. On one side, Werner Mölders, the Luftwaffe's golden boy, a cold-blooded tactician who turned dogfighting into science. On the other, Adolf, sailor, Malan, the steel-nerved South African ace who played by his own book and rewrote everyone else's. Neither man knew what was waiting up there, but once they met, there was no backing down. The sky lit up like a war drum, guns blazing, metal screaming, and by the end of it, one would be bleeding out on a French beach, while the other carried a legend he'd never forget. In the skies over Europe, the word ace wasn't handed out like medals. You didn't inherit it, you fought for it, and these two men had bled, sweated, and clawed their way to it. Werner Mölders, 27 years old, calm eyes, a jaw cut from stone. He flew like a surgeon, never wasting a single move. While other pilots chased adrenaline, Mölders chased perfection. He believed there was a pattern in the chaos, that every dive, every roll, every burst of fire could be calculated, predicted, mastered. He was the architect behind Germany's Finger 4 formation, a design that would change air combat forever. 4 planes moving as one, each covering the other's blind spot like gears in a machine. To his men, he was Vati, Daddy, a leader who taught them to think like hunters, not heroes. But beneath the iron discipline, there was a man chasing ghosts. He'd survived the Spanish Civil War, seen too many friends vanish in smoke. He told himself it was about tactics, but maybe it was about control in a world gone mad. And then, across the channel, Adolf, sailor Malan, a Navy man turned fighter pilot, built from the same steel as the ships he once served on. He didn't believe in luck, he believed in preparation. He studied the enemy, studied the wind, studied fear, until nothing surprised him. To his men in number 74 Squadron, he was tough as nails but fair. He'd walk the flight line in silence, a cigarette in hand, eyes scanning the sky, not looking for trouble, but expecting it. He believed courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was flying through it and pulling the trigger anyway. He wrote down his lessons, Malan's 10 rules for dogfighting, and those words would train generations long after he was gone. 2 men, same sky, different uniforms, and before the day was over, their paths would collide in fire. Noon, July 28th, 1940. The day looked quiet, the kind of silence that only war can fake. Far below, the English coast stretched like a sleeping giant, unaware that miles above, the greatest trap of the summer was being set. The Luftwaffe had a plan clever, deadly, and almost foolproof. Dozens of Heinkel bombers lumbered off the French coast, their engines humming like a distant storm. They would cross the channel just long enough to light up British radar, then turn for home before the Spitfires could reach them. Decoys, bang. The real killers, the sleek Messerschmitt 109s of Galland and Mölders, waited high above the clouds, engines throttled back, guns armed, ready to swoop down on whoever took the bait. Down on the British side, radar screens blinked to life.
Plotted
Tiny
and relayed,
dots
sir.
sliding
Multiple
across
bogies
the
approaching.
channel. The calm voice of a controller broke the silence. Bandits inbound, estimate 200. Scramble, scramble, sirens wailed across southern England. Pilots dropped their teacups, ran for their planes. Boots on metal grates, engines coughing to life. Within minutes, number 41 and number 74 Squadron were airborne, Spitfires slicing through the low cloud like knives through fog. They were young, some barely 20, but behind them was Adolf, sailor Malan, cool-headed, every movement deliberate. He didn't yell over the radio. He didn't need to. A single form up from him carried the weight of command. Across the channel, Werner Mölders sat in his cockpit, the world reduced to vibration, and vibration alone. The rattle of his oxygen mask, the hum of the Nenni engine behind him. He wasn't nervous, he was calculating. He pictured the British formation rising from their fields, how they'd climb, how they'd turn, how they'd fall into his trap. The plan was elegant, mechanical, inevitable, and yet some part of him felt that familiar pull, the quiet dread before the storm. As the German formation approached the midline of the channel, the sea below turned from blue to steel grey. The sun disappeared into haze. It was a strange half-light, neither day nor night, the kind of light where men forget they're human. Then, contact, a glint to the west sunlight bouncing off Spitfire wings. Mölders tightened his grip on the stick. "Tally-ho," came a British voice over open frequency. "Bandits at 11 o'clock, Angels 20. The battle had begun before either side fired a shot. Each pilot now played his role in a dance older than both nations, a deadly waltz of speed, instinct, and split-second judgment. From his vantage point at 25,000 feet, Mölders could see the British V formation breaking through the haze. They looked small, almost fragile, but he knew better. The Spitfire was a cornered fox, graceful, unpredictable, and vicious when pushed. He banked left, signaling his squadron. 1, 2, 3 attack. Engines screamed. The 109s dropped like falcons out of the sun, wings cutting the air, machine guns already spitting fire. Below, Malan's canopy filled with streaks of tracer fire, red threads tearing through the sky. He rolled hard to the right, feeling the G-force crush his ribs. The sky erupted into chaos. And just like that, the trap was sprung. The hunters had found their prey, but in the next 3 minutes, the line between hunter and hunted would vanish completely. The sky didn't just open up, it detonated. Gunfire stitched across the clouds like sparks on torn steel. One moment, there was order. The next, chaos, pure and blinding. Mölders dove first. He saw a Spitfire, framed in his gun sight, steady, perfect, a textbook kill. He squeezed the trigger. The cannons thundered. A burst of light, a scream of metal. The Spitfire rolled, trailing smoke into the sea. One down, he thought. 6 more to go, but war doesn't care about math. Because before he could climb again, something flashed across his right wing, another Spitfire, turning inside his dive, impossibly tight. It shouldn't have been able to move like that, yet it did. And for the first time that day, Werner Mölders realized he wasn't the only predator in the sky. The British pilot, sailor Malan, had seen him coming. He banked left, hard, nearly blacking out from the G-force. The stick fought back in his hands. The airframe groaned, but he held the turn, closing the gap, watching the silver Messerschmitt slide into his crosshairs. Breathe, don't rush it. He waited, half a heartbeat. Then a short burst. One burst. That was all it took. The tracers hit home, slicing through the engine cowling of Mölders 109. A flash, a scream. The aircraft jerked violently as black smoke erupted from the nose. Mölders bit down hard on his lip, tasting blood. The controls shuddered in his hands. Hydraulics gone. Fuel pressure falling fast. Not yet, he thought. Not like this. He kicked the rudder, rolled over, and dropped into a dive. The G's pressed him into the seat. The altimeter spun like a roulette wheel. Bullets tore past tracer fire from every direction. My machine rattled wildly, he would later write. I was surrounded by 10 Englishmen. They seemed to be mad at me. For Malan, it was no longer about glory. It was survival. He lost sight of the crippled Messerschmitt for a moment, then caught it again, diving for the channel, trailing smoke like a comet. He could have followed, finished the job, but his fuel was running low, and new enemy blips flashed on radar. He broke off, heart pounding, watching the German fighter vanish into the haze below. Meanwhile, Mölders fought his dying aircraft across the grey water. Every vibration rattled his bones. Oil covered the canopy. He couldn't see the coast, only the blur of waves beneath him. The engine coughed, sputtered, then fell silent. He was gliding now, a man and a machine, both bleeding, both trying to make it home. He spotted the French shoreline seconds before the 109 stalled. No time for landing gear, no time for prayers. He yanked back the stick, leveled out, and slammed into the sand. Metal screamed, the cockpit filled with dust. When he opened his eyes, there was no sound, only the hiss of the cooling engine. He tried to stand and realized his legs were wet and warm, blood, shrapnel, everywhere. That day, Werner Mölders, Germany's brightest ace, had been grounded by a single burst from a Spitfire, and somewhere across the channel, sailor Malan was flying home, never knowing the legend he'd just carved into the sky. Across the channel, the war in the sky had gone quiet. Engines cooled, gun barrels smoked, and the adrenaline drained away. In the fading light of that July afternoon, a lone Spitfire traced its way home. At the controls sat Flight Lieutenant Sailor Malan, calm but alert, his canopy flecked with salt and gunpowder. That day, he claimed 2 German fighters, destroyed, a solid victory by any standard. But history had other plans, because somewhere on a beach in France, Werner Mölders, Germany's most celebrated tactician, was being carried from the wreckage of his Messerschmitt, his legs shredded, his career suddenly grounded. For decades, the story seemed simple. Malan versus Mölders, ace against ace, the perfect symmetry of fate. It fit too well, almost like a movie. Even the records from both sides appeared to line up. The legend was born, but legends have a way of twisting with time. When wartime archives were finally unsealed decades later, a new name surfaced: Flight Lieutenant G.T. Webster, Nom 40 et un squadron. His combat report told a different story. Engaged 1 Messerschmitt, 109, heavy smoke. Enemy aircraft last seen diving for France at sea level. Every detail matched Mölders' own account of his escape. The altitude, the direction, the damage. It was too precise to ignore. So who really brought down Werner Mölders? The disciplined South African ace, or the quiet Englishman history forgot? Maybe it doesn't matter, because in that sky over the channel, they were all just men, each one gambling his life against gravity and time. Maybe it was Malan, maybe it was Webster, but in the end, it doesn't really matter, because on that grey afternoon above the channel, 2 men, born on opposite sides of a fractured world, met for just a few fleeting minutes, and in that moment, they became something more than soldiers. They became mirrors, reflections of courage, fear, and conviction, each testing the other, each revealing what it truly meant to stand your ground when the sky itself wanted to swallow you whole. War loves to draw lines between friend and foe, right and wrong, victory and defeat. But up there, in the thin air where engines screamed and clouds burned red, those lines blurred. All that was left was instinct, training, and the will to live one more second. Werner Mölders survived that day, but the war would soon claim him. Sailor Malan lived on to train a new generation, his name etched into the doctrines of air combat that still echo today. Both men are gone now, but the space between their wings, that narrow band of sky where death and destiny crossed, still hums with the memory of what they proved. That courage doesn't wear a uniform. That skill means nothing without heart, and that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones history can't decide who truly won. They were enemies for minutes and legends forever. So what do you think? Who really brought down Werner Mölders that day over the channel? The South African ace, Sailor Malan, or the quiet Englishman, J.T. Webster? Tell me your theory in the comments. I read everyone. And before you go, remember this: legends aren't built on medals or headlines. They're forged in split seconds of fear and faith, when ordinary men do something extraordinary and the world never forgets. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe, leave a like, and join me for the next untold chapter of history's forgotten skies. Because in the end, victories fade, but the stories, they're what keep the echoes alive.